Welcome once again to another edition of The Gauntlet. And you guessed it, I'm not Chris Perry, I'm Gaalen Engen. Today I'm going to be asking some technical questions, getting into the weeds a little bit, with a company called Skyharbour Resources. This trades as SYH on the TSX Venture Exchange. It's a very interesting uranium play. They have projects in the Athabasca Basin. Yes, you got it, the storied Athabasca Basin. I have with me today Jordan Trimble, Director, President, and CEO of Skyharbour, as well as Christine McKechnie. She is the Senior Project Geologist to help us with those technical terms, of course, well, me in particular. So we're going to start today's interview just to get a little bit of an overview of the company. Jordan, do you want to just tell us a little bit about Skyharbour Resources and what it is and where it's at?
Sure, absolutely. So Skyharbour Resources, as I think most of your audience probably knows, is a high-grade uranium exploration and early-stage development company. We built the company up over the last decade or so. We now have 18 projects scattered throughout the Athabasca Basin, which is as we'll get into, the highest grade depository of uranium in the world. It's in northern Saskatchewan, which is ranked as the #2 mining district by the Fraser Institute. So really the best jurisdiction to be looking for developing and producing uranium. Christine is our senior project geologist. She's been with the company now full time for better part of those 10 years. And I'll let her tell you a little bit about her background. I think most of the audience knows me. I'm the president and CEO of the company. Came in to run the company when we started it as a uranium company back in 2013. So I'll hand it over to Christine to tell your audience a little bit more about her background.
Hello, my name is Christine McKechnie, and I'm the Senior Project Geologist for Skyharbour. So my background is I did a bachelor's degree at the University of Saskatchewan and also did a master's there as well. I've been in the business for better part of 14, 15 years now. I've worked mostly in uranium in that time, though I've dabbled a bit with potash and gold as well. I've worked all over the Eastern Athabasca Basin for a number of companies, including JNR Resources, who I ended up doing my master's thesis on one of their projects, which now the project falls within the Skyharbour portfolio. It's a project called South Falcon East is the project now. And there's a deposit there called Fraser Lake-V, and it's an Alaskite type uranium deposit. So kind of a unique one in Saskatchewan, but it's mined elsewhere in the world, like in Namibia, Rossing. So I use that though as a tool to looking at these deposits to see whether they're potential sources for uranium. So I did my master's there. And then while I was finishing my master's, I worked with Canalaska Uranium for a little over a year. Then I moved on to Cameco for subcontract, and then directly through them for core logging and geologic mapping underground at their Eagle Point mine. So I actually got to see the uranium deposits that I'm exploring for in 3 dimensions underground, and got to see a lot of mineralization, basement hosted unconformity uranium mineralization there. And since then, I did a little potash stint between then and working for Skyharbour, who I've been with since 2017. And yeah, I've been kind of worked up my way from just being the project geo, kind of running the drill program in the field, to doing a lot more permitting, reporting, community engagement, drill program planning and vision in the office, budgeting and planning actual geophysical programs, and also interacting with our option partners and JV partners on exploration programs that they're planning, and doing data compilation and assessing new projects and new opportunities for the company.
That certainly is deep experience, well-versed in the world of uranium. And interestingly enough, even though the importance of uranium is making itself quite apparent in our transition towards green energy as the fuel for the natural base load that will actually help us make that transition, not a lot of people are familiar with uranium in terms of what it is involved in geology, and more so than they would with, let's say, gold or silver. So Christine, my first question I'm going to throw out to you. What is the particular geology of the Athabasca Basin? And what makes it prime territory for the high-grade uranium deposits that Jordan mentioned earlier?
So the Athabasca Basin is this very large, predominantly sandstone basin that was formed in the Mesoproterozoic more than 1 billion years ago. So these are very old rocks that we're looking at. And you have the sandstone basin that overlies Archean and Paleoproterozoic basement rocks, which include a number of granitoids, metamorphosed sediments, and all sorts of different rocks. These have been exposed to multiple phases of deformation and metamorphism during various orogenies. In the east side of the basin where we explore, the Trans-Hudson orogeny was a big part in shaping the way the basement rocks are today, whereas over in the west side of the basin, there is the Gaalen Engen, and there's some other events that help shape kind of the basement rocks prior to the Athabasca Basin being deposited on top of them. So the basin is generally sandstone, though there's some younger other calcareous sediments, but yeah, you basically have this basin sitting on top of this basement, and that the unconformity surface is where we generally see the uranium deposits and into the basement underneath. And where we find these deposits is particularly where you have deep-seated basement structures that have continued to be reactivated after the formation of the basin. And so you had multiple generations of fluid flow going along these faults. And the uranium is deposited under usually reduced conditions, and it's more mobile in oxidizing fluids. So the redox reactions play a big role in determining where the uranium is deposited and where we get these high-grade uranium deposits forming. So the Athabasca Basin sandstones are quite oxidized, so uranium doesn't really want to leave solution in there unless it either experiences a change in temperature, pressure, or chemistry. So these basinal fluids have circulated both through the basin, sandstones, and in the underlying basement, picking up uranium and then transporting it to these reactivated basement structures and depositing it either in the sandstone at the unconformity or generally in the basement below, though there is some examples of perch mineralization, but predominantly the mineralization is right at this unconformity or going down into the basement along these fault zones. Now, one of the biggest questions that still has a lot of controversy over it is what is actually causing that redox reaction to deposit the uranium where it is. So there's a couple of theories with that. Carbonaceous matter and graphite are a big thing, and we actually use that in our targeting as well. Carbon likes to suck that uranium out. It basically reacts with the fluids and it creates a reducing fluid, and when it interacts with the uranium-bearing fluid, that causes uranium to drop out of solution. Other possible explanations include sulfides as well, which sulfides and carbonaceous matter are quite often associated with these deposits. And that kind of helps lead into our exploration as well, as we're looking for these as part of the target. And the reason why the Athabasca Basin itself seems to be so high grade is that these basement rocks already had pre-existing concentrations of uranium in them that were higher than normal. And in some cases, there's even deposits formed prior to the basin that have probably seen some leaching, remobilization, and upgrading. You can get vein type deposits that are very high grade, like at our Hook Lake project with option Valor, or you can get these pegmatite granite hosted type of mineralization, like we have at Fraser Lake Zone B, which is akin to the Rosie deposit in Namibia. So you've got these pre-existing rocks full of uranium. They're thought to be one of the source rocks for the sediments of the basin. Plus, you've got these basement structures, deep-seated, that you have fluid moving along these things multiple times, multiple pulses, lots of fluid flow. And you get the uranium forming these deposits where you've got this change in chemistry and temperature and pressure of the fluids that are carrying the uranium. And the Athabasca Basin just got some of the best examples of this.
I gotcha. So I'm just going to break it down for myself just to make sure I understood everything. So uranium itself is an old mineral, correct? In terms of where it's placed within like the stratification of the earth, in terms like you're talking about the basic rock or the basement rock being pretty old, correct?
The basement rock itself is old, but there's actually been multiple phases of mineralization that have occurred in the basin after the formation of the basin. So all the uranium mineralization for these unconformity related deposits, for the most part, is post-dating that deposition of the basin, which happened around 1.7 billion years ago.
Okay.
One of the main pulses of uranium mineralization was thought to be about 1.2, but there's ages of 1.6 and 1.4 as well. But there's multiple age pulses of mineralization in these deposits. So it's not just one event, it's repeated fluid mobilization events that are related to far field tectonic stresses that have formed these deposits, and they still experienced fluid movement to recent modern times. So there's lots of deposits have, 900 million years or less remobilization events. So the main primary uranium mineralizing events were, around that 1.2 is one of the more important ones, and 1.4 billion years ago.
And that's why you see such a uniquely high grade nature to a lot of these deposits in the base, and that's one of the reasons is those multiple events happening and continuing to deposit uranium. And it's, as Christine pointed out, it was in great detail, but there's these specific characteristics that help guide the exploration and discovery process, which we can talk a little bit more about here.
Absolutely, yeah. You had mentioned carbonaceous materials being in there, or sucking up the uranium and allowing the sort of a deposit to form, as it were. So, how does this impact then uranium exploration? I mean, how is uranium exploration different than traditional exploration, let's say for gold?
So one of the main things that we do first with uranium exploration is you start with geophysical surveys, magnetics. Electromagnetics is the big one, because we are generally seeing these deposits associated with these graphitic conductors. EM conductors show up nicely on the EM surveys. And so we're looking for those because most of the uranium deposits that have been found in the Athabasca Basin have either been directly hosted in these structures or adjacent to these graphitic conductors. And so the graphite often does have a bit of carbonaceous matter with it as well, but a lot of that carbonaceous matter is actually kind of later with the mineralization itself. There's also a lot of sulfides with these as well. So that's something we use to kind of find these prospective corridors. And then we look at other things like the magnetics and gravity to find certain signatures that are the first areas to focus on, as well as resistivity is another one we use. In the sandstone, we look for these resistivity lows that are associated with alteration zones and structures. And so that kind of gives you an area to target as well. And we also look at the magnetics and the gravity, as uranium deposits generally are associated with
gravity lows, and magnetic lows are the margins of magnetic highs. And it's just because of these graphitic conductors, a lot of the deposits so far have been found where they kind of overlie or adjacent to Archean granitoids or quartzite ridges. Definitely a contrast in both the geophysical characteristics and also rheological characteristics of these rocks. And so we use that.
Okay. I was just saying, would this walk us through then the discovery process that you guys were initiating at the Athabasca Basin currently? Is this basically how you guys were?
And just to add to a little bit to that, you know, the geophysics are used extensively for lots of different mineral exploration and different metal types, right? But there's very specific, as Christine just highlighted, you know, very specific signatures that you're looking for. And one of the other very unique features of uranium is the fact that it's radioactive. So you do get to layer in additional tools that can measure radioactivity, including radiometric surveys and radon gas surveys as well. And these are fairly unique to uranium exploration and are used in the Athabasca Basin. So you do have you know, some of these other unique surveys and tools, and once you do have the geophysical work and data, another very important aspect to the discovery process, and I'll let Christine elaborate a little bit on this, is just the geochemistry that you see in the rocks. Much better understanding now of, you know, specific indicator minerals and alteration in structures that are conducive to or would indicate that there's nearby uranium. And maybe Christine, if you want to talk a little bit about, you know, what we look at in the geochem, specifically when we start drilling, if we have exploratory holes, or as it pertains really to the project that we've recently optioned at Russell Lake, being able to go into historical data and analyze those, you know, those indicator minerals and some of the geochem. I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you, Jordan. So yeah, one of the big things that we look for with these uranium deposits is there's certain elements that are so-called pathfinder elements. These include arsenic, nickel, copper, cobalt, sulfur, boron's a big one, and some of these other metals as well. And we look for these because they generally are associated with the uranium deposits. They generally form more of a halo to these deposits, that you can look for these changes in the values of these metals. And that can kind of give you a sense that, hey, you're near something. The boron is important because it's associated with a mineral that everybody calls dravite, and it's a tourmaline group clay mineral that is quite nearly so closely associated with the uranium mineralization and a lot of deposits. It may not necessarily be directly with the uranium mineralization, but it's quite proximal in the alteration envelope around these deposits. So boron's a big indicator of where uranium mineralization is. And for instance, at our Moore Lakes property, we have strong boron anomalies surrounding all the mineralization on the property, as well as the mineralization there has got the anomalous arsenic, copper, cobalt, nickel, and other metal. Zinc is another one. There's a number of different pathfinders, and yeah, we use those as well as the uranium concentrations to kind of hone in on our deposit model, where we might be in relationship to a deposit. And the geochemistry can also tell you something about the alteration, but we also look at methods like PIMA or shortwave infrared spectrometry that we can use to tell the clay mineral assemblages, as there's certain clay minerals that are diagnostic as well of the uranium mineralization. And these things can be subtle at first when you're further out, the signatures. That's why we need to not just look at the visual alteration of the core, but also at this SWIR data and this geochem data to tell us exactly what sort of anomalies are in an area. Uranium in the sandstone is useful as well. I mean, we do look for, if you see elevated uranium above about a ppm or so in the partial analyses of the sandstone, then that's a pretty good sign that you might be near something as well. But uranium doesn't always disperse very far from a deposit. So that's where we look at these other metals as well, as they can have more varied signatures. And like Jordan said, the radon as well is important in looking for these deposits, because the radon is produced as a daughter product of the radioactivity process. So that's one way that we can use this radon to find these deposits as well, by looking for these anomalies that are associated with uranium mineralization.
Now, speaking of exploration, where do you guys stand with Russell and Moore, your projects, the I guess you could say flagship prospects, excuse me, at Skyharbour? And while we get into that, what do you think your goals are going to be for the upcoming drill campaigns that you have at those locations?
Yeah, well, I'll start that off. So again, we've acquired quite the project portfolio in the Athabasca Basin. There's the two co-flagship projects, as you just pointed out, including Russell Lake, which we optioned up to 100% of from Rio Tinto last year, and we've just commenced our inaugural 10,000 meter drill program at this project. It's an advanced stage exploration asset. Big property, over 73,000 hectares, strategically located between the McArthur River Mine, which is the highest grade, richest uranium deposit in the world. That's just to the north of Russell Lake. And then the mill that processes the ore from McArthur is the Key Lake Mill, which is just to the southwest. And the road that services the mine runs through Russell Lake, and there's power lines there, as well as an exploration camp that we're staging out of, which brings down our drilling costs. So that's a major catalyst in source of news flow for Skyharbour over the coming months, and really over the next couple of years as we earn in at that project. And adjacent to Russell Lake is the other flagship project called Moore Lake, which Christine talked a little bit about, project that we have 100% of. We acquired it from Denison Mines. Denison is a large corporate strategic shareholder of Skyharbour, like Rio Tinto. A big vote of confidence having them in the company as an equity holder here for a better part of the last 6.5, 7 years. And that project, again, as Christine mentioned, is host to high-grade mineralization at the unconformity. And as we're finding out, or as we have been finding out over the last few years, is also host to high-grade uranium mineralization in the underlying basement rocks. And that's another important talking point for exploration and discovery right now in the Athabasca Basin. Is there's been a number of notable discoveries that have been made in these underlying basement rocks, these structurally controlled deposits. And again, I can let Christine talk a little bit more about that, but we've had success in recent years drilling a little bit deeper underneath the sandstone and underneath the unconformity and finding high-grade uranium mineralization at Moore Lake in these basement rocks. And we announced just over a year ago our highest grade drill intercept, which included a zone of 6.8% U3O8 over 2 meters at what we call the Maverick East zone at our Moore Lake project. So there's a lot of untested potential and potential new discoveries to be made in these underlying basement rocks. And Christine explained, how the uranium came up and was deposited in the basement rocks as well as in the sandstone. So moving back to Russell Lake, though, as that's really the focus for us currently, although we will be carrying out some continued drilling at Moore Lake, the adjacent Moore Lake project. Russell, we've just commenced the 10,000 meters of drilling. There were historical drill holes from previous operators, including Hathor and Rio, although there hasn't been much drilling at the project since 2016. So it's really the first major drill program in almost 8 years. There's a lot of exploratory drill holes and fences that were put into the project in a few target areas, including the first one that we're drill testing called the Grayling Zone. But a lot of these drill fences or drill holes were hundreds of meters apart. And what's interesting is without systematic infill drilling, you can miss a lot of uranium in a relatively small area. These are very high grade, relatively low tonnage deposits. And so that's one of the first things that we're doing at Russell Lake. In particular, the Grayling Zone is going in and doing a little more systematic drilling, both looking for sandstone and basement hosted mineralization. And there have been some historical drill holes at Russell that have yielded multi-percent U3O8 over skinny widths, but we think there's still a major new discovery that can be made there, and we're looking to unlock that value with this initial drill program. And so maybe Christine, if you have anything that you want to add to that, feel free.
Okay, so yeah, there's a number of target areas at the Russell Lake project that have seen various amounts of drilling, but a lot of the historical drilling done in the Athabasca Basin, not just at Russell and at Moore, back in the 70s and the 80s, when the first phases of exploration were occurring, they were only looking for stuff that they could mine using an open pit. So they would drill basically down to the level that an open pit was feasible at, and it didn't matter what they found, they quit their drill holes. And as time went on, there was more of a recognition that these deposits aren't just in the unconformity, but they quite often extend deep into the basement. And there are tons of deposits in the Athabasca Basin that are completely basement hosted. I mean, there's the Eagle Point deposit that I worked at, but there's also the Arrow deposit over on the west side. There's the Griffin deposit over at the adjacent Wheeler River property of Denison's, and as well as their Phoenix Zone, which is sandstone hosted. But like I said, there is a lot of drilling done in the past where they drill maybe 100 meters below the unconformity was kind of their thinking after a while. And it didn't matter if what they hit, they didn't think that the fluids would extend that far down. But now this more recent work that's been done, basically starting kind of in the last uranium boom and continued ever since, has recognized that these basement hosted deposits can be quite high grade, and they can extend quite a ways down, you know, hundreds of meters below the unconformity. And so everybody started targeting these basement hosted deposits. However, the one thing that was made clear to me when I worked underground at Eagle Point is how close you can be to these deposits. And if you're not looking for those subtle alteration and geochemical signatures, you may not think you're that close to uranium, depending on the deposit style. And so you could be a long strike of something that's really good, and you might just see a little narrow fault. You might have a sniff or something along it, but you might not think, oh, that's very prospective because it doesn't have a lot of alteration. The alteration only extends a narrow width around the structure. But then as you drill a long strike, you might come across an area where you get these dilational jogs where you get a lot more open space for fluids to flow. You get more fluid interaction, and there you'll see a lot more extensive alteration, and you'll see the uranium mineralization showing up as well. And so in some of these areas, like the Grayling Zone, they drilled back in the 80s, found some mineralization, including up to 3.45% over 0.03 meters in the best hole, RL 85-07, as well as another 0.1% over a half meter, a little bit further down in the hole. But yeah, like they found this mineralization, but nobody really necessarily followed up on it to the extent that we've decided to. There's a few fences, and then you'd have up to 200, 300 meter gaps between drill fences with no drilling. And as we know, like McArthur River, Cigar Lake, these are not huge, 2 kilometer long deposits or something. These are pretty narrow targets. They're few hundred meters long usually, and pretty narrow, pretty discrete units. You can get stacking of these zones, but if you're only seeing these sniffs, you might think, oh, there's nothing there, but you could just be on the edge of something. And if you didn't recognize these subtle features, you might not understand what is there.
So basically, you have to be a real sleuth when you're mining uranium. It's there, it's in high concentration, but you got to hit it right, and you got to know what the signs are. Am I incorrect by assuming that?
Yeah, no, that's a good way of putting it. It is a bit of the proverbial needle in a haystack. But you know, that's what's exciting. That was one of the reasons that when we started the company and we started acquiring projects in the Athabasca Basin, in addition to there being a very much contrarian deep value opportunity with the commodity itself, we were watching some of these new discoveries being made, in particular in the western side of the Athabasca Basin, that were generating major returns for investors and shareholders in these companies. And a lot of these new discoveries were being made using some new techniques and methodologies. And you know, as Christine has done a great job here highlighting just a much better understanding and knowledge of the geology, of the geochemistry to vector in on these deposits. And so a combination of improved technology and different types of surveys and pre-drilling reconnaissance work and exploration that you can do, coupled with just, again, a much better understanding of the geology and better geological models. This is collectively, it's allowed companies now to go in and with less capital needed, go in and make major new discoveries. And so, you know, again, at Skyharbour, that's exactly what we're trying to do here, in particular at our core and primary projects at Russell and Moore Lake, but also with some of the partner companies that are active at some of our other projects as well.
That's interesting. And it really, I feel great confidence in Christine as I'm listening to her speak, that she's the particular detective that one would require to sort of make sure that you are following the right track, that you are finding the deposit where it lies rather than missing opportunities going by. That's it's very interesting. I hats off if I had one. Now, Jordan, you were speaking about partners and JVs and that sort of thing. This leads, I guess, to a certain extent to the idea of Skyharbour also being a prospect generator in terms of the uranium space. And I'm wondering how that fits into the company and how is that, how are you guys pursuing that end of the business?
Yeah, so we've you know, we talked about the project portfolio. You know, I think by mineral tenure acreage, we're top 5 largest landholders in northern Saskatchewan, with over 460,000 hectares. We've continued to add properties and mineral claims through staking and through various deals that we've done with either other companies or prospectors over the years. So the 18 properties for over 460,000 hectares, there's really no way for us as one company to go out there and actively advance all of this ground, continuously raising money. And so as a secondary part to our business, again, as we've spoken about, the primary focus for us is at our more advanced stage exploration assets, making new discoveries or expanding known high-grade zones of mineralization. Secondary part to the business is prospect generation, in which we actively seek partner companies to come in and advance these secondary and tertiary properties. Typically speaking, it's not that they're less prospective geologically, but it's typically they're just at an earlier stage of exploration. And so we look for companies that will come in and fund that exploration and that work that needs to be done, ultimately with the intent of drilling and making new discoveries at these properties. We have 7 partner companies now, 2 of which have formed joint ventures with, including at our Preston project, Orano, which is France's largest uranium mining and nuclear fuel cycle company, is now a 51% owner in that project. And at our East Preston project, which is now majority owned 70% by Azincourt, and they've just commenced a 5,000 meter drill program at that project. Now, the other 5 partner companies are still earning in, so they still have to spend a certain amount of money in exploration and advance the projects, as well as pay cash and issue shares to Skyharbour. And so if you look at the all 7 of these partnerships and these option agreements, they total well over 70 million in partner-funded exploration and in cash and in share payments coming into Skyharbour, assuming that all of the companies do complete their earnings. And the breakdown of that is about half of that, so call it just under 35 million, would be in exploration expenditures by these partner companies, just over $22 million worth of shares being issued from these partner companies to Skyharbour, and just under 15 million in potential cash payments coming in. So it's a great complement to our drilling and our exploration and news flow generated from the primary projects. These companies are, most of them are either drilling, exploring, or are planning to be working at these projects. It generates a lot of additional news flow for the company and for our investors. It also offers additional discovery potential and exploration upside potential. If one of these companies is successful in finding a new big high-grade deposit, we'll benefit, and our shareholders will benefit through our minority interest in the project at the end of the day once they've completed the earning, as well as typically we do retain an NSR or royalty on the property. And as I mentioned, if it's a public company, typically there's some share component involved in the earning as well. So we try to maintain an equity position in these partner companies. So again, it really just provides our investors in Skyharbour, it provides what we're trying to do here really is build it up to be a one-stop shop for high-grade uranium exploration and discovery potential in the Athabasca Basin across several assets throughout the Athabasca, with other companies paying for the lion's share of this exploration. So it's very exciting. We built this up, this part of the business. We built it up quite extensively over the last several years, and we're generating some cash and getting some stock from these partner companies on an annual basis to help pay for the exploration that we're carrying out, that we're funding entirely at Russell and Moore Lake.
That really makes financial and logistical sense. You know, you guys have a great portfolio of properties, and to bring other people in to carry out the work, do the heavy lifting, as it were. You've already done the preliminary work getting in there and discovering that, you know, this is something that's actually worth something, and offering an opportunity elsewhere while still keeping your fingers in the pie. This is a very interesting prospect in prospect generation. Yeah. So I think that really works well to you guys, and adds more value to the company, that you know what you're talking about, you know where to drill, you know what's good land, what isn't, and you're offering opportunity in many ways to investors that are long-term and sustainable.
Absolutely. It's having multiple shots on goal or multiple irons in the fire. These aren't easy discoveries to make. They're, you know, as we just went through, they're tricky deposits to find, although they're, you know, as we pointed out, there's some new techniques and methods that are being used to help vector in on them. But having multiple active projects in partnerships does help increase the chances that there is a new discovery made.
Now, speaking of discoveries, and I'm throwing this out to both of you, you can decide who would like to answer it. Where is the uranium market heading? And, you know, what kind of catalysts are going to be driving that market over the next decade?
Yeah, well, I can start off on that, and I've done some other interviews with Chris and the team there, and we've done a deep dive on the uranium market. So I'll try to keep it short and sweet. But look, the uranium market for the better part of the last 10 years has suffered through one of the worst bear markets in the commodities history. Back in late 2016, the price dropped below $18 a pound, which in inflation adjusted terms is one of the lowest it's ever traded at. Now it has recovered. I think we're still in the very early innings of this sustained, what I believe will be a sustained bull market. It's trading just north of $50 a pound, and we're seeing both the spot price and the contract price. Keep in mind, there's Most uranium historically is traded through long-term contracts with mining companies and utility companies. And we're really starting to see the contract price and the contract volumes pick up here. Just last year, for example, in 2022, we saw 120 million pounds contracted, and that was up significantly from previous years. Now, in the uranium bull market of 05 to 07, those years, or 08, those years, we saw significant contracting volumes north of 230, 240 million pounds in a couple of those years. And that was a pretty good indicator of or what would be indicator of higher prices. And so it's exciting to see this contract market really starting to pick up. And we've seen some larger notable contracts signed just in recent weeks with the likes of Cameco and some other producers. So that's one point to make. And secondly, if we're looking at really what is driving this improving market fundamentals and sentiment, really I'd like to think of it as three kind of major macro trends or themes right now that are underpinning this newly found momentum in the space. And first and foremost, sentiment around nuclear energy is improving, and uranium is the fuel for nuclear energy. So as there's more nuclear energy, electricity generation globally, there's going to need to be more uranium. And nuclear is the only source of clean, emissions-free baseload, meaning 24/7, unlike renewable sources of electricity generation, which are intermittent. Nuclear is baseload 24/7, capacity factor over 85%. It's affordable, it's scalable, it's reliable, it's safe, and it's really the only source of that kind of electricity generation that we have. So for these decarbonization objectives lofty decarbonization objectives that most countries have set, nuclear has to play an integral role in these countries meeting those decarbonization objectives. And so we've seen that shift in a lot of different countries globally, where their energy policies in the last few years have changed and are much more favorable towards nuclear energy. And so again, getting back to these kind of three main mega trends, you got electrification, so need for more electricity generation. Nuclear obviously will play an important role in that. Hand in hand with that is as I touched on, decarbonization and clean energy. And then the third one, in quite topical right now, is energy security and independence. And we've seen with the war in Russia and Ukraine, this market starting to bifurcate east versus west. And simply put, the West does not produce enough uranium to meet Western demand and the needs of these Western utilities. And the market and the Western utilities have been heavily reliant on Eastern supply from Russia, from Kazakhstan, from other parts of the East. And those sources of uranium and other nuclear fuel products like enrichment and conversion products, they're not going to be there. There's a good likelihood that the West won't be able to be as reliant on these Eastern sources of nuclear fuel and uranium. And that's where Western companies in Canada, in the US, in Australia have to step up to the plate. So when you have 190 to 195 million pounds of annual demand, and you're only producing about 140 to 145 million pounds in primary mine supply, that's a major structural supply deficit, and you're running lower and lower each year with inventories and secondary supplies. There's going to be upward pressure on the price, and that's what we're seeing come to fruition here.
Well, there you go. It's an exciting market, to be sure, and an important one, very much so. I'm blown away, basically. This is an interesting company in the fact that it's doing business, and I think doing business correctly. It's not just you got a lot of juniors out there that have one project, and it's a Hail Mary and hope to God we find something here. Well, you guys have really sort of buttressed yourself in terms of exploration potential. You've garnered together a wealth of experience and geological knowledge in Christine here. It seems to me that, for me, Skyharbour has a really good opportunity developing for investors who want to get involved in the uranium space. And I, for one, after today's episode, have learned a lot more about the formation of uranium and the geology behind it. And I think that's an important thing for people to understand somewhat, so they know just what it is, what's the target that you guys are going for, what are the challenges that you face, and where you're sitting in terms of progress in developing those different deposits. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We've been speaking, of course, with Jordan Trimble, who is President, Director, and CEO of Skyharbour Resources, trading on the Toronto Venture Exchange, or TSX Venture Exchange, under the symbol SYH. We've also been speaking with Christine McKechnie, who's been delivering just a font of knowledge in terms of geological terminology and understanding. She is the Senior Project Geologist. And I would love for you guys to come back. This is an important thing, and I think what we've done here will really open up the investors in terms of their knowledge and understanding of the uranium market. So thank you very much for coming out. I appreciate it.
No, thank you very much. I really enjoyed that.
Awesome.